Welcome, welcome, welcome to the International Scene Lecture Series. I'm not sure how many decades we've been doing this program, but it's a lot, maybe 40 years. So thanks to all of the young energies that are here and eager to learn. But for those of you I don't know, I'm Linda Longmire. I'm a professor in the Global Studies and Geography Department. And again, have been one of the three co-directors of this lecture series for many years, and I like to admit. But we're so delighted that you're all here, even those of you who have been compelled to come. I'm grateful to my trafficking classes here, and my colleagues have brought their classes as well. So thank you so much for that. A couple other announcements before we begin. The next in the International Scene series is on March 4th. And we're having back, because of the new administration, a new foreign policy. So we're going to revisit some of the issues that we looked at last semester in terms of the conflict in Ukraine. There's been so much that has changed, that is in development, that is being improvised around U.S. foreign policy. And so Erin Mate, who's a young journalist who was here again last semester, will be here to lead us through some analysis of some of these changes in foreign policy. And that'll be, however, at 11:20 on Tuesday, March 4th. So please do come to that if you are free. It promises to be exciting. He's also again, dynamic, articulate young analyst and journalist. So I think you'll find that most interesting. Perhaps a bit controversial, but without controversy, there is no learning. So we welcome you to come to that. Then on March 11th, we're also welcoming back to do a deeper dive into what's going on in the Mideast. The talk will be on U.S. Middle East policy, what's ahead, with the analyst Phyllis Bennis, the author. She is a prolific author. She is head of the New Internationalism Project at Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. Always a great event to have her here. Again, maybe some controversy, but as I said before, we have to think critically and creatively in order to address all of these huge issues that we are all grappling with today. So please come to that. That's at a different day and time. This is Tuesday, March 11th, but at this time slot, 1 o'clock. Or sorry, this is 2:40. She's here 1 o'clock to 2:25 in that class slot. So again, I can promise both of these will be lively, provocative, interesting, important, even urgent discussion. So please do come. Also wanted to just briefly mention before I introduce our speaker, wanted to mention the fall class. I know some of you are pondering registering for the fall semester. But this class is called Introduction to Peace Studies, to Peace and Conflict Studies, and it's very much a kind of seminar, very interactive, very multidisciplinary, and that Professor Martin Melkonian from the Economics Department and myself will teach, and again deals with some big questions about peace, about conflict from philosophical points of view, from psychological points of view, and certainly, of course, from the external conditions that give rise to peace or conflict. And then we'll also look at some peace and conflict mechanisms and processes that hopefully can help with conflict, both small and large. So please come to that. Join us for that course if you are looking for a course. And Professor Melkonian and I would be delighted to have you. So lots of other events. I won't go on and on, but our wonderful cultural center, without whom nothing happens on this campus, has some other events that are listed in the back. There are flyers, so please take a look at those. One of the things I wanted to mention is, there's often to do a bit of an issue about events, should they always have multiple points of view? And sometimes that can be extremely constructive. But it's also important, I think, to see our entire campus, our entire semesters, as celebrating diverse points of view. So our position is simply that, not all positions have to be represented in any one event, and that rather to survey the whole array of events and programs and positions, I think is what gives us a creative, well-rounded education. So all by way of saying that's kind of the behind the pedagogy of things. So I want to introduce now our speaker. We're so delighted that he's here all the way from Dublin, Ireland, and which I know is a favorite place for some of you, and for those of you who haven't been there, well, you just must. And Ireland is a particularly interesting place. It's a small country, but punches well above its weight in terms of having an impact on global issues. Though maybe in peace, when we're talking about peace and conflict, maybe we shouldn't be have punching metaphors at all, but I think you get the idea. It has an enormous amount of influence, particularly for a small country. So Eamon Rafter, who is our guest today, is going to talk about, as you see from the slide, the military-industrial complex, power, privilege, and profit. But from an interesting point of view, again, from the point of view of a small country, and a country, however, that has had this long tradition of neutrality, and about which I think Eamon will also say a few things, as well as a legacy of peacemaking, peace building, though obviously in these times subject to some pressures to join NATO and change its own policy and tradition. So he'll hopefully talk a little bit about all of that. At least I hope so, because there is much, much to be learned. He is not only someone who analyzes these issues, but he's a peace educator, a peace facilitator. So he also has a lot of experience, a ton of experience in looking at how people, what are the precursors to conflict, and also what are some of the processes for healing and change and conflict resolution. But that has to start with, again, understanding some of the big macro issues like the military-industrial complex. And so we're really delighted that he's here. He's been involved in so many good peace groups, as you can see from the flyer, World Beyond War, Swords to Ploughshares, the Global Campaign for Peace Education, and again has a wide array of interests and experiences. And so we are most grateful that he's here. I actually met Eamon in Kathmandu last summer at an International Institute for Peace Education. So that's another one of his interests and part of his background as well. We're delighted because he not only, provides a vision of what World Without War might look like, but also walks the talk and I think helps us understand some of the concrete and difficult steps to actually get there. And so please join me in welcoming Eamon Rafter. And just for information, what we'll do is he'll speak I'll try to contain him to half an hour, and then we'll open things up, as we always do, for your comments, questions, insights. And that will be with the floor mic here in the middle. So if you're going to, if you have some questions, and I do hope you do, that's how we'll do that. But please join me in welcoming Eamon to Hofstra University. He's never even been on Long Island before, so we'll have to give him a good welcome. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Linda, and thanks again for the invitation. It's great to be here and welcome you all. Thanks for giving this time out of your day. My intention here today in talking about the military-industrial complex is not to frighten you, but it certainly is to provoke you to think about it. And if in any sense you feel empowered to act on that on those understandings, that would be also great. It's a difficult topic. It might be a bit heavy, but let's see how we can approach it so that it helps your understanding, which is really what I'm here to try to do. Now, I hope my accent, my Dublin accent, isn't too strenuous or difficult, and hopefully afterwards there will be things you might want clarification or questions. I would really encourage and hope that you will, and open to being challenged if that's what you want to do as well. I perfectly welcome that. So, I mean, effectively, I want to start off. I've put a few of the organizations I'm involved with, working with here, but I'm not going to go into detail about these organizations. Swords to Ploughshares is perhaps the one that occupies most of my time, because we're looking at a developing arms industry in Ireland and how we can, what we can do about this to maybe encourage a slightly different direction of travel. However, I'm going to start off. I've given an image there of some of the kind of things. That's a picture of St. Bridget, not literally St. Bridget, but someone who we're trying to make look like St. Bridget, and we're delivering a petition to the door of the Foreign Affairs Department of the Irish government, asking them to reconsider the dropping of neutrality and a move in the direction of militarism. So I'm going to be talking about militarism, so I put that in as a reference point. More weapons equals more war, and that equals less security. That's one of the places that we're coming from with this. And that weapons destroy people and planets. So there are just some preliminary considerations. The background to my talk, I'm going to spend a few very quick minutes because I think it's important you have a sense of where I'm coming from with this. As Linda said in her very flattering introduction, Ireland is a very small country. And Ireland, since its independence, has been formally a neutral country. But I've put up a couple of things on the slide here because often when we talk about neutrality, people say, well, what's that? And how does that work? What does it mean for a country to be neutral? The Irish Constitution formally states that we affirm our total and absolute commitment to exclusively democratic and peaceful means of resolving conflict. Okay, so we're formally committed to that in our Constitution, and yet our Constitution doesn't formally state that we are a neutral country. So that means neutrality is not enshrined in our Constitution, and for reasons that I'll address, that may be problematic as well. But neutrality, not in the Constitution, is a very important part of Irish identity. It means, effectively, it's not that we are not engaged with the world or we're trying to hide and keep out of the way of trouble. It's that we feel an active non-engagement in military alliances offers us different possibilities in the world to act in a peaceful way that might provide alternatives to militarized conflict resolution, which, believe it or not, militarization is characterized as a form of conflict resolution. It doesn't really resolve anything, I would argue. So it's not about hiding, and it's not about having no opinions on what's going on in the world. It's about not taking a side in a military sense, and I think that's very important. So you might be more familiar with the word like non-alignment, which is a word that's often used. Now, some people think, oh, if you're not on our side, you must be against us. We're actually arguing that non-alignment is a third version. We're not against you if we're not with you. And that's a little hard to get your head around, but I encourage you to think what that might mean if you are in a situation where two of your friends are arguing. Do you have to take the side of one of them and then be against the other? Or could you be an agent that might help to sort the situation out? So that's more where I'm coming from. So it's not about indifference. And it can be an active peace-building process. And that's what we'd like to think Ireland has the capacity to offer in the world. We're a country of less than 6 million people, still divided. Northern Ireland is still part of the United Kingdom. So you know, we have our own struggles and our own issues that we've had to face, and a conflict that lasted for 30 years and saw a lot of people killed. So I think we have some understanding that resolving conflict won't happen by providing more weapons to people. That's not going to work. It didn't work in Ireland, and we don't think it will work elsewhere in the world, or even that there's evidence that it does historically. Neutrality, Irish neutrality, is under pressure in the context of the EU. The EU is being increasingly militarised, and the European Union is often now acquainted with NATO. Ireland is not a member of NATO, has no intention of joining NATO, but let's say we've become closer and closer to NATO, and we are sometimes described as in a partnership. I'm not quite sure what that means, but that would be one of the approaches. But we're told, don't worry, we're not going to join NATO. But we are the only country, except, well, there are 4 neutral countries in the European Union, Ireland and Austria being the two, maybe the bigger of the two. The others are Cyprus and Malta, or very small, basically non-militarized countries. So if there's only 2 countries left, Sweden and Finland have given up their neutrality. They're now part of NATO. Things are looking, you know, we're under pressure. And the Irish government has been encouraged not to be an outlier, which is the word that's used. Don't be an outlier, get involved. And we are, and I am, of the opinion that our involvement and engagement in military adventures is neither in our own interest as a country, nor will it make a great contribution to the world. We think we can offer a different kind of contribution. So it's very important that we highlight the link here between militarization and the opposite, if you like, our argument for neutrality. So I'm going to talk about the military-industrial complex from that perspective, if that makes some sense to you. Now, you're all probably familiar with the expression, I don't know exactly where it comes from, but you've probably heard it. When all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you haven't heard it before, I'd ask you to think about it, because it seems to fit well in this discussion about militarism in the world. And so I'm going to argue here that when it comes to the military-industrial complex, whose scale is so immense, it's real vast, it's almost beyond comprehension. It's such a huge avenue of power, privilege and profit, that the hammer defines politics in many ways. And the world looks like a set of nails to many of those who reap the benefits that power and militarism seem to offer. So, yeah, when all you have is a hammer is kind of a backdrop to what I'm going to say. Now, I'm going to refer to a group of people here called the innocents. What I mean by that is people who suffer most in modern wars, who might also be described as non-combatants in many cases, or very simply the disposable people of the world whose lives are lost in conflict. And in the moment we're living in, this is happening in Ukraine, it's happening in Palestine, in Gaza, it's happening in Sudan, in the Congo. The people who are losing their lives, losing everything they have, are very often women, children, professionals like medical people, doctors, nurses, you know, teachers in schools. These are what I'm calling the innocents. So this is an arguable term, because some people might say, well, they're not innocent because they're part of that country that doesn't like us. I'm going to characterize them as innocents, expendable people who are increasingly the victims of modern wars and on the receiving end of militarism. So I would argue that lives are not equally valued in the world we live in. Some people are considered less grievable than others, insofar as their lives may not count as much as the lives of people who live in North America, in Western Europe, and other parts of the world. But the reasons why people are considered less grievable are very complex. I'm not going to go into it, but they include racism, xenophobia, homophobia, a disregard for poor and dispossessed people in the world. And Judith Butler, who writes about this, uses that term non-grievable. Simply, their lives don't matter. I ask you to think about that. Those who are on the receiving end. Through the greed and inhumanity of war profiting, militarized mindsets, violence for profit is a threat to the future of humanity, and it's also a threat to the planet that we live in. So this is a very important part of what I want to say. It's people, but it's also environment, and literally the air we breathe, the ground we walk on, is being destroyed by militarism. And it doesn't even take a war for this to happen. Military maneuvers and testing of weapons cause untold damage to the environment of the world that we live in. A question I would pose when I mention the word innocence is, can we call ourselves innocent when our governments, the governments that we elect, are complicit in this process of rendering lives non-grievable? That's a question, and I have to put it to myself as well. So the military-industrial complex is the process that manages all of this. It's deadly, it's corrupt, it's a system of manufacture, militaries, states, and alliances organizing for war and organizing war. It counts its profits in billions and the cost in human lives. The former US President Eisenhower in 1961, he famously warned the USA, this is kind of amazing when we think about it, he warned the US, today the world's biggest arms producer, to guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. President of the United States and former chief of military and defense in the United States. He was aware of that, and that was 1961. It hasn't happened, though, because the military-industrial complex is now arguably, we could call it the military-industrial academic government complex, and add whatever you want. Maybe we could throw in media as well, because media, might be considered to play a major role in this, in kind of softening us up and making us sort of see that this is somehow inevitable or whatever, we don't have an alternative. So this whole complex, with its levels of corruption, is hugely profitable. It's a revolving door where the cogs move in and out of different sectors, from the military, civil service, arms manufacture, political office, and then it goes around again. So a good job high up in the military makes you sought after on retirement to work for an arms company, and and it goes around and round. In all the places I mentioned, lives are the cost of this process. The vile trade, which I call it, costs at least 500,000 lives every year. 500,000, 500,000 people are losing, in recent years, have lost their lives on the receiving end of weapons. On both the in context of wars, but also small arms. The obvious connection between the arms trade and the loss of lives is not reported in the profit accounts. That doesn't seem to figure. And the merchants of death, the people who manufacture weapons, don't really account for this. Doesn't seem to be their business. The scale and extent of current arms production is staggering. It's beyond belief, quite literally. Even if I throw out figures, total global expenditure in 2023, which are the last official figures we have, reached $2.443 trillion. Okay, now that's even hard to conceive. I don't even know really, I can't really envisage what that means. It's a lot of zeros, and it's on the rise. The 10 largest spenders were the United States, China, and Russia, the first three, all increased their military spending. And the giant corporations that dominate the trade, you'll be familiar with the names: Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, a UK firm, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, etc. The military-industrial complex is growing more international and transnational, I would argue. Just some facts about the arms trade. I'm not going to go into these in detail, but you know, if you look up these figures, you will notice, you know, the 100 highest, biggest sellers. You know, that comes up to 632 billion. You know, America, Britain, countries, Russia, China. It's a global affair. It's not just happening in one side of the world or the other. It's all around, and arms companies, generally speaking, are not too bothered where they sell their weapons. The European Union is becoming a bigger player in this process. The European Peace Facility, European Defence Fund are more and more, I'd say, on the bandwagon now. And the militarization of Europe is which concerns me. One thing to consider maybe for some of you who are here and studying the human trafficking and sex trafficking is that military bases throughout the world, and bear in mind the figure I think of US military bases is more than 800 now outside the United States. These bases are magnets for the sex trafficking of women mostly, for prostitution and various forms of corrupt activity, which are not accounted for or by the militaries that use these bases. It's not, don't get me wrong, it's not just the US, but the single biggest figures are American military bases. So, you know, it's a driver of sex trafficking, and all this, if you look at a place like Okinawa, one of the American bases in Japan since the end, it's been a huge issue there with the people in Okinawa, how women have been trafficked in the area, and, you know, prostitution, which had never been a feature of life in that part of the world, in that particular island, became, you know, a huge money spinner. I'm not only talking about weapons in the traditional sense, because we need to think about nuclear weapons as well. Although the majority of countries in the world support the treaty for the provision of nuclear weapons, none of the nuclear powers do, obviously. The powers that have nuclear weapons don't support it. And there's been a ramping up of spending on nuclear weapons as well. This is something that I'm not going to go into detail here, because spending on nuclear weapons is, some of it is, you know, is filed under secret information that we're not completely allowed to we're not able to corroborate it in many cases. But there are many countries in the world who have signed up and said we don't want nuclear weapons and we want rid of them, and the spending on them is kind of out of control. We haven't been as close to nuclear confrontation as we have been recently in connection with Ukraine. And the doomsday clock, which shows how close we are, has got to its highest or closest point to the midnight hour, 5 minutes to the midnight hour to be precise. Again, not trying to frighten you, but trying to make you aware that this is a reality that we're living in. The arms trade drives the insanity, if you like. Make no mistake, a third world war would be a last world war. So, like, let's not think about that in the sense of, oh, that might be the next world war. That would be the last. The myth of feasible strategic use of nuclear weapons is something that I would argue strongly against being in any sense reasonable or rational, or you don't want to go there in the sense of thinking about it. Okay, so the arms trade and the military industrial complex, they're sustained by a series of myths. And just to, and I won't go into detail on the myths, but of course, the biggest of all of these myths is the one that I list here first, that higher defense spending will make us all safer. There's zero evidence for this anywhere, that spending more money on weapons means that we're somehow in a safer place. In fact, much of the evidence will point to the opposite. that the more weapons there are in the world, the less safe we're actually becoming. So this kind of equation of safety and weapons, I will argue strongly is a myth. I could go into a lot more detail about why I say that, but these myths are parroted by media, and notions like this that it'll make us safe. It's driven by the people who reap the benefits largely, who make the money, and the returns are vast. Let's be really honest about this. The returns on the profits are huge. So some of these myths that I've listed here, for example, that national security, which is something that you hear referenced all the time, requires blanket secrecy, and that as citizens of democracies where huge spending happens on arms, that it's for our own good, we are often told, that we're not given the information about what's going on. Okay, so secrecy is part of defense, and therefore we don't. I would argue that these are myths, and that largely speaking, if we as individuals don't buy these myths, the societies that we live in very often do buy these myths, and they're filtered through a media propaganda process that makes them look quite reasonable, and often we're not shocked to be told, oh, sorry, that's secret information. You can't be told. You can't be informed about this thing. Militarism is the other thing I mentioned about climate. It seems that the arguments for militarized security preempts any notions of human and ecological security, which are the things that we might need to be thinking about, it seems to me. So the political establishment defines national interests, and it disconnects this from the needs of people in the natural world that we live in. So national defense is not necessarily going to save the environment, and probably not the citizens of the countries that subscribe to that notion. So that's a disconnect, and the needs of people in the natural world that sustain us are not included. It's a short-term outlook on security. It presents military threats as the main risk, and in so doing, it avoids the multiple other threats we're faced on this planet. And you will be aware of these as much as I am, because we know, for example, that climate crisis, the threats to climate are real. They're not something that's been drummed up by in order to make money. They're real, and we're experiencing the consequences already. And yet, the focus and the money spent on militarism that could be better spent on climate protection and measures is completely contrary to the interests of people and planet. So militarism is a huge contributor to the global climate crisis, and the impacts are often completely exempted. This is unbelievable. They managed to get an exclusion on military contribution to the carbon contribution to climate crisis. So they're not even counted. There's even a crazy suggestion that environmental costs could be made greener, and that we could have green wars in the future. Now, what on earth would that be like? And I think you can go and look up the information from the Pentagon, because they told me that this was happening, that the Pentagon is greening its business to make its militarized aircrafts use more environmentally friendly fuels, for example. I mean, this is beyond ridiculous. The weapons will kill people. The weapons will destroy environment in the same way as they have always done, and even more so because they're becoming more lethal and more sophisticated. This is the sort of crazy side of it. The notion that green wars might happen is beyond farcical, I think. But of course, as much as anything, preparation for war is as big a problem as at the actual waging of war. The preparation involves the huge spending. It involves terrible abuse of environment. So the military bases I talked about all engender, create environmental damage throughout the world, especially in relation to water, but many other areas as well. The deposit of toxic chemicals that go with the military base are responsible for huge numbers of cancers, etc. And that's a global phenomenon. So the huge impact of weapons on the natural environment is out there to see: poisoned water, increased carbon costs, and arguably the Pentagon is one of the biggest polluters on the earth. But many other places are up there too. Long-term notions of security get in the way of the military. Militarism is very short-term. The long-term thinking that we need about security, about human beings and planet, are another thing altogether. And we've been reluctant to get involved in that kind of thinking. The short-term thinking suits the industry of military the complex. It makes it possible to propagate these myths that I've referenced here, and to mask the notion that what it's really about is making vast amounts of money for the companies that are involved. So let's be very clear. I would say the military-industrial complex actually makes us less safe. It significantly contributes to climate crisis and the threat of nuclear annihilation. So I think there are very strong arguments for why we might need to temper it. I'll throw out just a few anecdotal things that you may know. Some of them might surprise you. 40% of global corruption in business globally, 40% is considered to take place within the arms industry. Which is pretty significant. And that's a figure that comes from Shadow World, which is I think, very credible research institute that looks at arms spending and corruption in the arms industry. And by corruption, I mean politicians in many countries, it's in their interest to create opportunities for arms companies because they will directly get feedback and cuts on the benefits of the financial benefits short term for themselves. 40%. A unit cost of military hardware. The F-35 aircraft, which you've probably heard reference to, in bombing Gaza, the Ukrainians received a number of them from, I'm not sure, Holland was one of the countries. The F-35 aircraft, a single aircraft, it costs in the region of $80 to $100 million, one aircraft. That's a unit cost. Okay, just think about that. And there are thousands of these aircraft, hundreds of thousands. The U.S. as the country that you're living in, if studying in, if not from, spends more on so-called defense than the 5 next biggest countries combined. Okay, they're spending, and it comprises almost 70% of global arms spending in the world. Almost 70% of that figure that I gave you, 2.43 trillion. NATO countries comprise almost 60% of the spending on arms in the world. 60% of NATO, and countries like China, for example, although it's increasing significantly, their spending is minuscule in comparison, but it is increasing very fast. The justification of levels of military spending requires the maintenance of a constant climate of fear, because that's what makes it okay to buy more weapons, because we are constantly told in Ireland we've been told in particular that's why we need to get rid of neutrality, because there are new threats. Never clear what the threats are. assume they're talking about Russia, but there's never been any evidence that Russia wants to get its hands on Ireland. It would be very easy if they did want to, but I don't have any evidence, or don't think there's anything that would ever give us reason to believe that Ireland is next. I mean, I hope I'm not made look foolish in another few years, but it doesn't. It seems to be highly unlikely. And yet Ireland wants to be a player in the arms industry, and especially avail of the incentives that the European Union is very willing to provide to bring Ireland, as they say, up to scratch. That's the term they use. The argument now is that Ireland is spending far too little on weapons and therefore is not a net contributor to European security. So there's a push. There's a push, and the Irish government, as part of the European Union, has to answer that push. The Irish people, 75% of people say we want to hold on to our neutrality. 75% say neutrality is essential, it's a part of who we are. And we don't want to be involved in wars, we don't want our children conscripted, and we don't want to be involved in especially the kind of wars that are going to cost the lives of the innocents that I'm talking about. So NATO expansion is a big part of that. Sweden and Finland are now members of NATO, had been traditionally neutral countries. One of the big drivers in those two countries, Finland and Sweden, for membership of NATO were arms companies, because they're the first people to reap the benefits of being a member of NATO. They make quite a lot of money out of it, because when you're in NATO, you now have requirements to up your spending levels. So the cheerleaders for NATO membership, who are also more present in Ireland now, are people with a financial interest in selling weapons. There's much more to militarism than the arms trade. It's a much more complicated and broad, we can talk about it at a number of levels. We can talk about it from a perspective like patriarchy as mechanism of the patriarchy, as the enforcement measure in the world, global capitalism. We could talk about it from those angles. There's a million different ways we can talk about militarism, and the arms trade is only a part of this. But it's a very key symptom. So, I mean, that's why I want to focus on it. It's highly symptomatic. There's increasing convergence between military and civilian spheres in society. Now, that has never been a feature of Irish society. We have paramilitarism, which was part of the conflict, but official or national militaries have. There's always been a separation, and I know that this is not the case in the United States. There's a visibility of military, and again, that's for Americans to decide if that's something, and also the status of military, and again, I'm not here to offend anyone who has family or people who are in the military. I'm talking about militarism as an institutional phenomenon, because obviously the first people to get defensive or maybe bad word, who are going to get jumpy about this are people who are going to lose their jobs if militarism, or fear they will lose their jobs. So I'm taking that into account. So that convergence between military and civilian, the elites, military elites, they're afforded in many places radical monopolies through the subsidies, to provide services to military. It's a very lucrative process. So contracts gained with the military can be vastly, can be very, very lucrative and extensive. So security, when we talk about the word, and I haven't used it too much, but it's often the lens that we talk about all this stuff. We talk about security. What's that? Making us safer, maybe, I hope. But it's increasingly defined as whatever can be met by military means, which to me is not what security is. Security is whatever makes us safe from the very diverse threats we face in the world. So it's not only defined what's going to be met by military means. I mean, militarism won't defeat a virus like COVID, or whatever virus we're going to be dealing with next on a global level. Military spending won't solve that problem. So they're the kind of threats we need to think about. Diplomacy should be, could be, might be an alternative to militarism. The problem with this can be that diplomacy is very mixed up with and militarized in itself, and this gets very complicated. Through negotiation and arms control, maybe there could be ways that we could sort out some of the problems in the world if we were prepared to spend more money and build skills and develop capacity for negotiation and mediation and alternatives to militarized security. But I mean, negotiation and arms control. The US currently employs more people to maintain one single aircraft carrier than the total number of diplomats that it employs. Now, as far as I'm aware, although this could have gone up since the last time, the United States Navy has 12 aircraft carriers. Each of the personnel involved in the maintenance, running, operational side of each of those aircraft carriers, which are mobile bases, is more than the total number of diplomats. Think about that. So the question is, where does the priority lie? It's very skewed in my estimation. And if we had a bit more focus on diplomacy, maybe that would be a start. Anyway, it is vital to promote alternatives and break the cycle of profitable militarism, because it is so profitable, and therefore it's very appealing to so many to be involved or to be reaping the benefits. For the sake of democracy, accountability, justice and equality, and a safer, more peaceful world, we need something else, and we need to think about human and environmental security, which is really my main kind of point to make to you today. It's a mindset, militarism, it's a culture, it's profitable, it's about the pursuit of power as well. It's mixed up with power, wealth, domination, control of resources and of the world. It's central to this kind of notion of the dog-eat-dog way perspective on looking at the world, People are potential enemies rather than potential friends. And that's a way of looking at the world which feeds, I think, some of the militaristic trends. People like myself who oppose militarism will often be defined as defeatists, traitors, enemies of the state, etc., etc. And I think I'm certainly well used to this. We get called out. We in Ireland, we're often called, we're the pro-Putin brigade, because we argue that neutrality is important in Ireland. Oh, so you like Putin then, do you? Not especially, no. However, that's the type of thing, if you advocate or you say, I'm an anti-militarist, or I believe in alternatives to violence in the world, you might be characterized in that way. The military-industrial complex needs wars to thrive, so the abolition of war, killing of innocents, should be things we're thinking about. Abolition of war might sound highly idealistic and impractical, impossible, utopian, but I've no problem in saying that my vision of a future world, I may not see that, I think it's unlikely that I will, but I think if slavery could be abolished, I know it isn't in total in the world, but if slavery as an economic system could be argued against, could war as a system of control and profit-making, could it be abolished? That's a question, and I don't have an answer. So maybe non-violent alternatives to war and weapons need to be prioritized before it's too late for the people and the planet, because the way this is heading isn't great. However, I don't want to leave you as a kind of depressed group of people that have come all the way from Dublin to really, to piss you off and think, oh God, could we go and think about something else? The world I'd like to live in is actually, it may seem very far away, but if human beings actually would put a little more thought into this and begin to think of the kind of world we would like to live in, I think we'd all have lots of ideas we could come up with. And I mean, the question then, of course, is like, where do you start? Or, what are the practical things you can do? But there's lots of people already doing these things in the world, and you're aware of many of them, even in small places and little communities. This is a big issue. We're not going to just sort of throw out a few ideas and that'll sort it out. This is a long-term thing. If human beings want to be around in the longer term, I think it's one of the things we've got to really engage with. And if the planet that we all absolutely depend on, the air that we breathe, if we are to be able to inhabit this planet in the long term, this is going to have to be one of the big issues that something has to change with. So let's try and find nuggets of hope in this, or maybe that human agency has overcome difficulties in the past. And I think we are capable of taking on some of these challenges. But we need, first of all, to think about it, to understand it, and to see, is there a possibility that we could play a role in this? So thanks for listening, and we'll take whatever questions. Thank you.
The military-industrial complex, this enormous, challenging, and sometimes overwhelming question, or about Ireland's specific response, or some of the peace projects that are part of. I'm always reminded when someone talks like this, and I'm supposed to be talking to the mic, that it's think critically, act optimistically, think pessimistically, but act optimistically, and I think Eamon embodies that. And so hopefully you've got some good questions. We have a mic here, so if you could go to the mic, that would be very, very helpful.
There we go.
Thank you.
All right, so now that I can be heard, I was just curious, since you said we should try and think optimistically about this, how are we supposed to think optimistically about the military-industrial complex when, like you said, we were warned about it by Eisenhower back in the 60s, and now you say it's been intertwined in academics and media and just about every other major industry in the world. So how do we go about, I guess, unplugging it?
Of course, it's the big question, which I can't easily answer. But, I mean, I will say, there's the thinking about it, which at the start of my talk, I emphasized that I want people to think about this stuff. But thinking about it won't be, it won't be enough, obviously. We need to be active in some way. A culture which says that, protests will change the world is part of that. But, we are aware that... protest is part of life in democracies, and it doesn't necessarily, people are not just going to say, okay, we'll get rid of this because the profits are so lucrative. So I think the only way that this is ever going to be, and when I say optimism, I think Linda's way of looking at it is, your intellect can be quite pessimistic, but your will needs to be optimistic. So, what drives you is, or what drives me, I don't know what drives you personally, but what drives me is kind of optimism, sometimes against the odds. Because some people might say the definition of a crazy person is that, when things aren't looking good, they keep trying, But, I say that that's a definition of humanity. That even when things are not looking great, we're not going to give up. And what I found when I talk about this in a little country like Ireland, most people say, yeah, kind of, I agree with you, weapons are very bad, but we don't have much to do with that in Ireland. And then you say, well, you point out some of the developments that are happening, and people say, oh, we didn't know that. And then people say, well, if we don't know about things, we're not going to act on them. And I still think there's a huge gap in information and understanding. And that's why I often start with the word security and get people to talk about it. Because if we were to say we want to live in communities, in countries where we feel safer, we might begin to find other ways to create safety. But as you say, how can I help you to be optimistic? I can't. But I can say, educate yourself insofar as you can, if there's a way you can do that. Engage and involve, if that's something that you could do. And also, be aware that a few people doing something that creates movement, that creates, is what builds optimism. This is not going away anytime soon, though. Let's be clear about that. Okay, so it's a long-term process. And my opinion is, be part of the vision and the desire for something different, and don't expect it to be sorted any day soon. But that's not a reason not to be involved.
Thanks.
Okay.
Hello. My question was honestly pretty similar. It was about how, with these myths feeling like very entrenched in everything I feel like I've learned or talked about in the past, outside of like classes and stuff like that, how can we really change people's perspectives about something when it's not something in the direct forefront of most people's minds, especially about the higher defense spending equals increased security myth?
Yeah.
Because it just feels so entrenched. How do you begin to try and change people's mind about something like this? And also, where did this myth really get started in?
Yeah. I think, the myths, which I didn't kind of time to go into detail on because I have them up there and there's a lot of stuff about them. I don't know where you get your information on, from, but nowadays our options for information are multiple. But if we look at mainstream, what we're offered in terms of information and what's going on in the world, you won't find these myths challenged in any sense. You know what I mean? I would be a person who argues that the media have responsibility in accurate information, but also as a civil society endeavor that supports the welfare and the interest of people, and that doesn't seem to me to be the kind of media we have in many or most countries. So we need to find ways around that, whether that's better use of alternative media or some focus on these myths. I work a lot with students from different countries, and one of the questions I ask them very often is, what in your life makes you feel safer? And when we talk about that, most people, certainly people in Ireland, won't say that I have a gun in the house and that makes me feel safer. People in the United States might be more likely to say that, but there'll be lots of people who won't because of many, episodes that we're aware of. So there is a questioning that I would argue in the United States that guns make people safer, yet there is a very big vested interest and a lobby that's not going to let go of that. But what if more people said, no, this isn't the way we want things? What if that became a bigger thing as a political movement? Now, I know that's a particularly challenging issue in the United States. I'm aware of that. But, the country that I live in, guns, you can't buy a gun. No one's allowed to have a gun. The police in the street don't carry guns. And one of the reasons they don't carry guns is on the foundation of the Irish state, it was decided that the police carrying a gun would make them a more likely target. That might be because they carried guns. And there's actually no evidence in Ireland that has supported changing that situation. Now, there are armed units in the Irish police that can be called, but your ordinary police woman or man in the street does not have a gun, is not allowed to carry a gun. So it's a different idea about security, you know? I mean, I'm not saying that we don't need these people. These people are important, the job they do. But it's been decided that that wasn't the best way to do it. And there has been no strong demand anyway, for change in that. So in terms of the myths, first of all, we need to interrogate these myths. We need to make them better understood, create a better awareness about them, but also look at what the driver of these myths is. And to my mind, it's mostly, the motive is profit. One of the main motives is profit, because the profits are so absolutely phenomenally vast. You know what I mean? And I think unless that's made clearer to people, they might never get around to this thing of saying that we need to question these things. But again, not an easy process. But I'd say if you took one or two of those things and created a conversation around them, it would be interesting to see what people might say to you.
Thank you.
You're gonna have to give me a second. I'm 4 times. Hi. So for context, I work with kids, and I've had kids ask me what happens during war, and I've always described it as two not so great people with a lot of power lead their own people to further selfish remains, and then people around the world take sides. So I was wondering what you would define neutrality as, and why we should take it to someone of like an elementary school level who can't understand big words like this. Yeah,
okay. I think it's very important that when I'm talking about neutral, I'm not talking about, you know, the situation where an individual, let's say, is indifferent to those issues that you might be talking about, interpersonal issues or whatever. So it's not indifference. It's taking a principled and non-aligned stance in situations of military conflict, if you like. So, for example, perhaps one of the biggest military alliances in the world I refer to is NATO. Ireland has made a decision on the founding of the state not to be a part of that alliance, which means we don't send soldiers to combat and go into places like Afghanistan or wherever. That means that Ireland has the potential to play a very different kind of role, that we're not seen as military aggressors. It also has a lot to do with the fact that we were a colonized country, that we're on the receiving end of militarism for very many years. So my point about, even if we use neutrality as a metaphor, the metaphor is not one of looking away. The metaphor is a principled engagement. So I'm engaged in the situation because I potentially can have a relationship with both sides. And that gives me more potential to be useful and influential in stopping what's happening, if you see what I mean. You know, so it means you're using the option of not taking sides to offer support for some kind of resolution of the process. Now, you may not be able to do that on your own. I mean, for example, the conflict in Ireland, one of the biggest players, and it might seem strange, but one of the biggest players in the resolution of the conflict in Ireland was the United States under Bill Clinton's presidency, because the chief envoy in the peace talks was George Mitchell, who was an envoy of the United States government. The United States government was seen as an acceptable third party and played a very important role. Now, that's not a role that the United States plays that often in the world. I'm not saying it doesn't, but it's not perhaps the best known role. But it was very significant in Ireland, and it made a huge difference. So George Mitchell played the role of a neutral in the resolution of the Irish conflict. And it's acknowledged till today that contribution was essential and wouldn't have happened. The peace agreement wouldn't have happened without someone in that role. So I think when you're talking about children, the notion of taking sides, I don't know, some people say it's a human instinct, but maybe we've been socialized or trained into the notion they have to take a side. Maybe you don't. Just something to think about, and that maybe that would give you a different kind of power.
Perfect. Thank you.
So I wanted to bring up a question I saw on social media, and I wanted to see your, one, if you think it's even possible, and two, just your point of view and your thoughts about it. So what if we treated everyone who wanted to buy a gun in America, at least, the same way we do for women who want to get an abortion, with the waiting period, the constant the violent videos and education showing, like, do you know what you're doing? What are your thoughts and feelings about that?
I mean, I'm not sure if it's the approach, but I mean, in terms of offering an alternative, something I think needs to happen. And now I don't know whether that is the one that would work. But again, when we think about it, if you're told that the valuing of human life is what you said, the counselling or support for women in that situation is seen as protective of human life, how on earth could guns be defined as protective or supportive of human life? So I think what needs, and I'm not an expert on arms in the United States or disarmament, or I know it's a huge question, but I think there's a need for a perspective change, and like what you said is a different way of looking at an issue. It strikes me, it strikes us as astonishing that guns are so easily available in this country. I mean, I still can't understand how that is so easy, and acceptable in a society. But again, I've already said, given you reasons why I think it is. It's because people at a certain level in the society do very well out of it. They make a lot of money. But I mean, I always wonder, do people who benefit from weapons sometimes experience tragedies in lives that are caused by guns? And I'm sure they do. So in some ways, it doesn't make sense to me, if you understand. But if not the example you gave, it requires us to look at it in a different way. And if you're not going to be able to abolish ready access to weapons, I think you have to think about some kind of measures that make them much more, if not a prohibition, then just not easy to get your hands on for whatever reason. It seems to me to be far too easy. But that's the global metaphor. It's very easy to buy, if you have money, to buy lethal weapons, which is why regimes all over the world do that. We need a different way to think.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi.
I don't want to speak for everyone here, but I believe that the majority, or at least the majority of us, thank you and appreciate the hard and dedication work you put into assisting global conflict. With that being said, I have two questions. Have you and your groups made any significant impacts? And considering the progress you have made so far, how long do you anticipate it will take you to achieve a greater influence? And my second one is, have any companies or organization you've been at proposed a new strategy to global conflict, such as improving, or much of I like to say, correct NATO, especially since avoiding war or halting the MIC is increasingly difficult?
Yeah, thank you. Difficult questions, and I kind of can't answer them easily. In terms of progress, first of all, the first thing you said, I would say we certainly, last week I was talking to a group of people who were kind of who said to me, what you've told us, we didn't know. And they said to me, why don't we know about this? And I said, well, it suits certain people that you don't know about this. You know, so for example, the current move in Ireland, if not to get rid of neutrality, to water it down so that it doesn't mean anything anymore, it's been a very slow drip process. So people can hardly even see it, you know? It's been highlighted more recently because we have an airport in the west of Ireland called Shannon Airport, which is used by US troop and weapon carriers to transit to the Middle East. And we've been trying to draw attention to this because it's a breach of Irish neutrality. But the Irish government says we have reason to believe there are no weapons on those aircrafts. To which we say, how do you know? And to which they reply, we have the word of the United States government. To which we say, okay, but would it be worth occasionally checking, just in case someone had made a mistake? And to which they say, if we feel there's a reason to do that, we will do that. Now, through freedom of information, we've discovered there has never been a single check on an aircraft that flies through Shannon Airport at any point. However, what you'll notice now is the amount of people protesting and highlighting that we have a problem with Shannon Airport, especially since the Gaza and Israel-Palestine situation. People are saying very loud and in loud numbers, we don't want this. It's not an anti-US sentiment, which is sometimes the way it's put, because Irish people and Americans are like, you know, we're friends, we're family. We don't want military aircrafts coming through our country. Now, I would say we've been quite successful so far because the Irish government have no answers. They're embarrassed about this, and I think they're in an awkward position that they're going to have to do something. Same thing with neutrality. They're stuck with it now. We also have in Ireland an occupied territories bill, which is, I think, the first country. It's been passed in the Parliament and in the Senate, but held up by the current government, who say this will go through, but they've held it up for a long time. So we're kind of advancing those things because I think for Irish people, it's more to have on our conscience, our conscience, the death of innocence in other parts of the world because we did nothing is difficult. So we have small successes which don't change the world, but again, I come back to this thing: the more people are aware of stuff, the more the information we can get through to people, and members of the Parliament as well. I mean, I was outside the Parliament in Dublin last week, and a woman came out and she said, "Can I stand in for a photograph?" And I said, in my ignorance, "Sorry, I'm not sure who you are." And she said, and she told me who she was. She's a quite senior elected member of the Parliament, who had just been elected, so I didn't know her. And she said, "We're on your side, don't worry." And she said, "I hope you don't mind me being in a photograph with you." And I said, "No, I'm delighted." So, I mean, these things are happening, I mean, and at the same time, behind the backs of the people, I said 75% of people want to keep neutrality. Behind the backs, governments will act in maybe not the same way. So that's I suppose, it's not that you think suddenly everything's going to change. It's a slow and it's a gradual process of awareness. But I mean, there's a lot of things I don't feel proud of in Ireland. I mean, lots of things. Ireland is a very flawed country, like most of the countries we live in. But one of the things I do feel proud of is that Irish people have espoused neutrality and said we're not the invaders of any country in the world. And the only thing we've done with our military is they're part of the United Nations peacekeeping group, and that's what they do. And we would like that to stay that way, Now, have we succeeded? No. Are we working on it? Still, yeah. Are we engaging more people? Absolutely. So, there are small successes in this. It won't change, let's say, the fact that NATO, the question of NATO is such a big big issue. And not so much in Ireland, we're not members. But in every country that is a significant member of NATO, there are people who are kind of trying to point out that maybe the word defence, which you'll be familiar with the word defence, actually doesn't, it's not what it means. It means something else. You know, it's a euphemism. As far as I'm aware, the Department of Defense in the United States, is that what it's called now? It was previously called the Department of War. And okay, so that's a sleight of hand. So you turn it into a war department, it becomes a defense department. We have a Department of Defense as well that's actually trying to make our military a bit more, you know, bigger players. You know, so these things are the things that we're going for. Now, I'm not sure if I can answer your second question, but if you see where I'm coming from, NATO is a huge, huge thing. I can't really cover it here in the sense that it might be helpful for you, but I think we need to think about that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Any other questions, comments? Marty?
Yeah. Hi.
I
was wondering if you'd comment over those people, particularly in the military, who argue that peace is through strength. I know that's what your talk has been about, but that's been the mantra that seems to sell well to most Americans. And in fact, many go so far as to say we can, even in this nuclear age, we can wage and win a nuclear war.
Yeah, I mean, I would go back to, you know, what I talked about, nonviolence and exploration. And is it Jean who said nonviolence is a weapon of the strong, not the weak? You know, it seems to me that military options are the resource of the weak. It's an admission of weakness. That's what I think. Now, I don't mean that to denigrate. I'm saying that given the choice, would we, in a situation of dispute with anybody, would any individual think, well, if I knock his head off, that'll solve the problem? I mean, everybody knows it won't. It could be that you'll end up in prison or whatever. But, you know, it's a weakness, I think, when we give in to the temptation of violence, because we have the hardware at our disposal. And it comes back to when all you have is a hammer. Because if I've got a bigger hammer than you, you know, I can prevail. If that's what I think is strength, I am deluded, I think. But because I have hardware, you know, that I think makes me strong, it actually doesn't, I don't think. Do you know what I mean? In a funny way, I'm trying to remember the person who said it's not those who, it's those who suffer most who will prevail. Now, that's not an argument for suffering. It means that it's not inflicting on violence on others that it is going to help you prevail. It's how long you can keep away from the temptation of violence, I think, that will help you to prevail. That's a hope I have as much as anything. But the reason I say it is that we are all, everyone in the world is interconnected in some ways. We're part of the same family, even though we've managed to divide ourselves into a million different varieties and find problems with. We're all the same in many, many ways, and we have differences and loads of them, and that's great. But I mean, any harm that we commit to other members of the family is actually causing harm to ourselves. And I think that's one of the greatest arguments against inflicting militarized violence on other people. It's going to come back and hurt you. This country would be able to testify to that if there was an honest accounting. But Ireland, very much the same. You know, the conflict persisted for 30 years and nobody was winning, you know. Levels of violence were increasing until a kind of day came when people said, we need to find another way here. This isn't going to, no one will prevail. I argue with violence. I mean, and as I said before, the nuclear option should make that evident, that that's not winnable. So, non-violence, weapon of the strong, I hope. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Eamon. Again, other flyers in the back, other events coming up, March 4th, March 11th. So please join us for that. Thanks for your thoughtful questions and your good attentions. That's all part of creating a culture of nonviolence, so we appreciate it. Take care.